Family Sunday. Two things before we get started. Flip over to Luke chapter 15. You can be doing that. And then also, I think we're live today on Facebook, and we have a little trouble this morning kind of getting things started. But if you want to go ahead and pull your phone out and share that, you can. And again, we're doing this to help people know the news about Jesus if we possibly can. We're going to probably have to switch mics, it sounds like, again already this morning. But that's why we do that and be sharing that. A little 4-year-old boy named Johnny, he asked his mother, said, "Mama, where do babies come from?" And his mother said, "Well, baby, or honey, babies come from the stork." And the little boy asked his mom again, said, "Well, Mama, where do, what keeps bad people from robbing our house? And who does that?" And the mama said, "Well, baby, that's the police do. They keep bad people from robbing our house." And the little boy said, "Well, Mama, if our house were to catch on fire, then who would come and save us?" And the mama said, "Well, baby, that's the firemen. They will come and save us." And the little boy is just really inquisitive. He said, "Well, Mama, where does food come from?" And she said, "Well, baby, food comes from farmers." And this little 4-year-old boy, Johnny, he looks up to his mom and he said, "Then what do we need Dad for?" And we live in a society that's increasingly asking that question. Why do we need fathers? And I know it sounds kind of silly to hear that, but it's true. And while we always affirm our mothers and want to continue to affirm what your mom's doing, especially single moms, that you're raising your kids and doing the best you're on, you're bringing them up, you're bringing them to church, you're doing everything you can to raise them right. We're behind you. You're doing great. We're with you 100%. Yet at the same time, while we affirm mothers, we can't ignore the impact that a father has on a child. And yet again, we live in this generation where this generation is asking this question continuously, whether or not we even need dads around. Fathers have disappeared. And they've disappeared from homes, and we're living really now at a time that's referred to as a fatherless generation. And we're experiencing the negative effects, unfortunately, because of it. In 1960, 11% of children, regardless of race, lived without a father in the home. Today, 1 in 3, 33% of children live without a father. And we can point to poverty or education or the government or whatever as a reason. I'm sure there's some factors in there that play a role. But let me tell you the real reason behind this. It all boils down to our attitude about marriage and the family. And until that changes, we're going to continue to see this trend. Now, I don't say that to cast stones this morning, or to make anybody feel bad. Of course, some of you, you're in situations that they're out of your control, right? I mean, you wish that things were different, but they're not. And if that's you, and again, if you're single, you're raising children on your own, or there's a father in your home and he's not contributing at all, I mean, you just keep doing what you can. You keep loving your kids. You keep pointing them to Jesus. You ask God to fill in all the gaps that you can't do. I mean, we all know mothers, right, who have had little or no help from a father, who have raised children that every one of us will be proud of. But at least statistically speaking, and much more than we're going to see in just a moment, fathers make a huge difference in the life of the home. And I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of statistics, but I do want to put some up on the screen for you this morning. Did you know, and that's probably going to be hard to see, but 63% youth suicides, fatherless home. 90% of all homes, runaway children from fatherless homes. 85% of all children show behavior disorders come from fatherless homes. 80% of rapists with anger problems, fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts, fatherless homes. 75% of all adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers, fatherless homes. 85% of youth in prison grow up in fatherless homes. And of course, just having dad in the home isn't the solution. Right? I mean, children living in a 2-parent household who have a poor relationship with their father, 68% more likely to smoke, drink, or use drugs as compared to teens in two-parent households. Now, again, I don't read that to you this morning to make anybody feel bad or if single moms, I don't read it so you'll fret and think, oh no, woe was me, or so that those of you who have two parents in the home, you can feel good or you can boast. I mean, we all know situations where children rebel in the best of homes. But at least statistically speaking, dads are important, aren't they? And we don't need the stats. I mean, we don't need the stats. We know this. Lucille Ball, shortly before her death, she did a TV interview with Merv Griffin. He asked her a serious question, pointed question. He said, Lucille, you've lived a long time now on this earth. You're a wise person. He said, what's happened to our country? What's wrong with our children? Why are families falling apart? What's missing? And Lucille Ball answered without hesitation. She said, Papa's missing. Things are falling apart because Papa's gone. If Papa were here, he would fix it. And ironically enough, if just having a father in the home isn't that doesn't just affect behavioral issues with children. Did you know that a father has the strongest impact spiritually in the life of a child? And in fact, I read this week, some research. It was done in Switzerland a few years ago. This research kind of blew my mind. And they examined to see how even if religious habits were transmitted from parents to children. And they studied all these kinds of different variables, but one critical factor towered above the rest. And it was this: the religious practices of the father determined whether the child would attend church when they're older and out on their own. And the shocking result of this study was the fact that the religious habits of the mother had little effect at all on the kid's future as it pertains to their church attendance and devotion to God. Listen to these statistics. When mom is a regular churchgoer, but dad attends on occasion, 3% of kids become regular churchgoers as adults. When mom is regular, but dad never attends, just 2% of kids become regular attendees as adults. When both mom and dad attend church regularly together, 33% of kids grow up to become regular church attendees. And this is where this study got crazy for me. When dad is regular, but mom only goes once in a while, figure actually jumps to 38%. And then get this. The most likely scenario for a kid to continue to attend church as an adult is if dad attends regularly and mom never attends. 44% of kids in that scenario wind up as regular church attendees as adults. Now, that's crazy, right? And moms, that doesn't mean that, you just give up and, they're just giving an excuse to stay. I'm just going to stay home. And, if my kids have a better chance with me at the house, I'm just going to stay home. That doesn't mean that at all. We know that moms have an incredible impact. But it does mean this. At least generally speaking, dad has the greater influence in the spiritual health of his children. And listen, I know this sounds old-fashioned, but don't you think it's why God admonishes the man to be the spiritual leader in the home? I mean, doesn't it just make sense, right? And guys, let this be a reminder to you. Our primary task is to disciple our children. Our primary task is not to teach them to be an athlete or to teach them to get in the best college or to land the top career. Our primary task is to teach them to love and to know and to follow Jesus. My friend Evan Meyer said, men, our children are not likely to find a father in God unless they find something of God in their father. And I think he's right on the mark. And so this morning, I want to talk about what a godly father looks like. And I'm not going to try to beat up our guys. And, a lot of times we do that on Mother's Day. We praise moms. And on Father's Day, we beat up our guys. Listen, I want to encourage you, man. I'm encouraging you because you make a difference. You make a big deal. And I want to study what a godly father looks like. And I want to do so by looking at the most famous parable that Jesus ever told. It was the parable that you and I know as the prodigal son. But this parable is much bigger than just a religious son who gets into trouble. This parable shows us what God the Father is like and the type of characteristics that you and I need to be a godly father. So look with me, Luke chapter 15, verse 11, and we'll read through 32. Notice what it says. Jesus continued, and this is a parable. Okay, a parable is a teaching. It's an illustration of a story that Jesus uses here to make a point. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. And so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have had food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard the music and dancing, so he called one of his servants to ask what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and you never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me anything, even a young goat, so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" That's probably a very, very familiar parable to you, but oftentimes we just kind of skim over it some. But I want you to catch the characteristics of this father. Yeah, first of all, I want you to notice that this godly father in Jesus' parable, he was selfless, wasn't he? I mean, this man was pretty well off, financially speaking at least. We know that he had hired servants. He had an estate. He had extra garments. He had a ring. He had fatted calf, resources to hire a musician, throw a party when the occasion called for it. And normally the way it would work is that the younger son would get a third of the inheritance. The older son would get a double portion. The younger son would get a third. But generally that's after the death, right? This son here in Jesus' parable comes to his father and he basically tells him, he says, "Dad, I want my share of the estate. I'm walking away from the family. I'm done. Give me my money now." Now, can you imagine being placed in that scenario? I'm guessing most of us would probably say, "Yeah, right. You know, whatever. I mean, you're asking me for this now? Are you kidding me, right?" In fact, you're going to have that attitude. "Well, I'm just going to spend it all, myself, and you ain't going to get none," right? I mean, that's probably what most of us would say, or at least think, right? In fact, I saw this week, actually a book that was called "How to Spend the Kids' Inheritance." So maybe you need to look that up this week. It's on Amazon. Look, I don't need a book. If my kids probably don't get anything, but I don't need a book to know how to spend some money. You probably don't either. But this father, he gave him his inheritance. And whether you agree with what his father did, or disagree, it was a selfless act. Now, your father probably hasn't given you your inheritance in advance. And he may not be able to give you anything, if much at all. But chances are he has or is going far beyond what is expected to provide for you. The Associated Press this past January published an article where they detailed the cost of raising a child today. According to the Department of Agriculture, you know how much it costs to raise a child? From age birth through age 17, it's $233,610 to raise a child. That's annually $14,000 a year. Now, you'll note that's through age 17. And so you send them through college, you get them kind of started into early adulthood, it's going to be much more than that. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at that figure and think, I could do a lot with that, right? I got 3 kids in that age bracket, right? I'm spending, according to this, $42,000 a year just raising kids. I mean, there's no wonder I'm broke all the time, right? Someone described a father once as a man who carries photographs in his wallet where his money used to be. And some of you know that to be true, right? But let me ask you, have you ever thanked your dad for sacrificing for you, providing the basic needs in life, and oftentimes going much, much more than that? And if he's no longer here, maybe have you thanked your Heavenly Father for your earthly father's input and what he has given for you? Have you tried to emulate that in your own children, with your own children? Because here's what happens. I mean, if you're like me, most of the time, growing up, we remember Mom being the one who was around most, right? It seemed like she was the one who was always there when you needed her. If you scraped your knee or you needed help with homework or you had a problem, you would go to Mom. And there's no doubt about it, Mom was there, no question. Praise God for our moms. But I sometimes wonder if we shortchange Dad. I wonder if he gets shortchanged a little bit. Irma Bombeck was a well-known humorist for about 30 years or so, up into her death until 1996. But she once wrote this. She said, Daddy just didn't know how to show his love. If it was Mom who held the family together, he just went to work every day and came home, and she'd have a list of the sins we'd commit, and then he'd give us the what for about them. She said, I once broke my leg on a swing set, and it was Mom who held me in her arms all the way to the hospital. Dad pulled the car right up to the front door of the emergency ward, and when they asked him to move it because that space was reserved for emergency vehicles, he shouted, what do you think this is, a tour bus? But it was Mom who carried me in. It seems all my life that Dad parked the car someplace or came in wet or half frozen. My Mom never left me for a moment. Dad was always sort of out of place. At birthday parties, he busied himself blowing up balloons and setting up tables or running errands. It was Mom who carried in the cake and put the candles on it for me to blow out. She said, I remember when Mom told him to teach me how to ride a bicycle. I told him not to let go, but he said it was time. I fell, and Mom ran to pick me up, but he waved her off. She said, I was so mad, but I showed him. I got right back up on that bike and rode it myself. He didn't even feel embarrassed. He just smiled. When I went to college, he was fiddling with what else? Luggage and boxes. It was Mom who sat down and told me that everything was going to be all right. And she did all the writing. He just sent checks and let me know how pretty his lawn looked now that I wasn't playing on it all the time. Whenever I called home, he acted like he wanted to talk, but he always said, I'll go get your mother. When I got married, it was Mom who got all choked up and cried. Dad just blew his nose loudly and left the room. All my life, he said, where are you going? What time are you coming home? You got any gas in your car? Who's going to be there? No, you can't. Not Mom. She just loved me. But Daddy, he just didn't know how to show his love. And then she said, unless he showed it. And I failed to recognize it. And maybe your dad wasn't the greatest at verbalizing his feelings or showing his love. Most of us guys, we're not that good at it. But maybe you're not the greatest at recognizing it either. But that's the way sometimes dads show their selfless love. And dads, one of the things that we need to remember this morning is to do just that. Our children need from us our selflessness. Not that we're giving them everything they want, but they need to know we're giving them of ourselves and we're sacrificing our time and energy on their behalf. But you know what? There's something else I see from this father here in Luke chapter 15. There's another characteristic. There's a characteristic of wisdom. Of wisdom, right? When I read that this father gave the inheritance to his son in advance, that sounds foolish to me. Doesn't it you? I mean, why would he do that? That's a bad idea. And by the way, this isn't prescriptive, all right? This doesn't mean that you just go home today and you can give your kids their inheritance and everything's going to be all right. That's not the point here. But apparently this father had wisdom enough to realize that his son had to learn some lessons on his own. And he released him, fully aware of the dangers that were ahead. And it takes wisdom to do that, doesn't it? I mean, it takes wisdom. It's hard to know when to protect and when to release. And it starts out small, like letting them ride a bike for the first time or sleep over at someone's house and then sending them off to camp. And it gets bigger. They start driving and dating and college and then a wedding ceremony and all that. It's difficult to know when to protect and when to release, isn't it? And I think that's why we have to lean on God big time for His guidance, right? I mean, that's why prayer is such an important part of parenting. And we're praying not only for our own wisdom and how to raise these kids that God has given us without instruction manual. We have no idea what we're doing. But we're praying for our kids personally. Listen, church, you may be a great parent, but your children need your prayer support. They need your prayer support. Your prayers will be a lifeline to your children. Bob Russell tells about a wedding he conducted a few years ago. It involved two strong Christians, both of them from solid Christian homes. He was good friends with the bride's family in particular. But Russell said at the beginning of the wedding rehearsal, just before everyone else was to eat, the father of the bride-to-be stood up to give a toast. And the only words that he spoke were actually directed toward this very faithful Christian man that his daughter would be his daughter's husband the next day. And he raised his glass and he looked at his future son-in-law and he said, Brian, we've been praying for you for 24 years. He said, I've been praying for you for 24 years. I just didn't know your name. And it takes wisdom to do that, doesn't it? It takes wisdom not only to teach and admonish your own children, but to pray for them now and to pray for their future, to pray for their future spouse, to pray for potential kids and grandkids. It takes wisdom to know how to do that. Well, this prodigal son, was flat broke. He goes off, he spends all his money, he's broke, he ends up on a pig farm, and there were nights that he was so hungry that he wanted to get in there and share a meal with the pigs. Finally said, enough's enough, I've got to go back. I've got to go back home. And it brings me to the third characteristic that we see of this godly father, and that is of grace. This father was gracious. The prodigal son makes a decision that he's going to go back home to dad. He decides, maybe I can just go back and just be a hired servant. Maybe he'll hire me back to work with his men in the field. And you can probably imagine what this journey would have been like. Right? As this son journeys back, probably the whole time, what do you think he's doing? He's rehearsing his speech that he's going to give to his father. And probably you could imagine the type of lecture that almost every father would give this son when he comes back home. I told you so. You should have done that. You should have listened to me. Whatever it may be. But none of those things happen. Neither of those happen. As the son nears the estate, the father sees him from a distance. And what's he do? He runs the meeting. And when he reaches his son, he throws his arms around him, embraces him, and they rejoice. And in spite of the anger of the older son, this father throws this party for him. This impromptu party on behalf of this wayward son. He gives him grace. He gives him grace. And dads, I think one of the greatest attributes that we can show our kids, it's grace. It's grace. Listen, if our goal for them is to receive the grace that God offers us through His Son Jesus, then it needs to be on display in our lives. Our kids are not perfect. Your kids are not perfect. And they need to know when they mess up that you will forgive them. The prodigal son did his father wrong, didn't he? I mean, he did him wrong. He wanted out of the house, no more rules, give me my money, embarrass the family, lived a wild life. But when he came home, he was poor, he was homeless, he was broke. His father saw him coming. And I don't think he just happened to be looking up in the field one day and there his son comes. I think he was looking for him. And he goes out and he ran and he greets him, and he didn't demand an explanation. He didn't give him a speech about consequences in life or none of that. He just said, son, welcome home. Welcome home. And that's grace. That's what grace looks like. And I realize that not everybody in here, you grew up with a dad like that. In fact, some of you grew up in very difficult circumstances. And for you, it's negatively affected the way that you view God your Father. And fathers, I want you to understand this. How you treat your children can have a major understanding, have a major impact on their understanding of how they perceive God. Listen, regardless of what your earthly father was like, though, your heavenly Father is full of love and full of grace and full of mercy. Jesus wants you this morning to understand what God is like. That's what this parable is all about. It's a fascinating parable, and it's an incredible story that Jesus tells. See, no matter what you've done, no matter what your life has been like up to this point, no matter, no matter how rotten you've been, no matter all the things, you've got a Father in heaven who is waiting for you to come home. You've got a Father in heaven who is waiting to shower His grace on you this morning. You've got a Father in heaven who is ready to throw a party on your behalf if you'll just come home and you'll trust Him. You can do that. You can do that. God gives us that opportunity every day that we have breath in our lungs. We can come. We have a Father who has open arms and waiting for us. Max Lucado's a writer, but he's also, and you probably know, maybe you've read many of his books, but he's also a preacher. He preaches at Oak Hills Church in San Antonio, Texas. It's a large church. He tells about a time a few years ago. It was during a Sunday service, and it was time for communion to be passed, and the emblems were being distributed. Lucado was seated in front with his family, and he said he heard a little boy's voice from behind him saying, "Daddy, what's that?" And he heard a second voice, and it was the boy's father. And he whispered in a whispered voice by saying, "Well, son, that's a cracker. It symbolizes Jesus' body when He died on the cross." A little bit later, Lucado heard the boy ask again, "Daddy, what's that?" The father responded, he said, "Well, that's a cup of grape juice. It represents Jesus' blood. It was given for us when He died on the cross." And he said then in a quiet and whispered tones, Lucado listened as this father explained what communion was all about to this son. He said the more the father talked, he began to recognize his voice. It was a voice of a friend of his. It was of course, the church is very large, and so it's impossible to know who, different voices, but this was a voice of a friend. He knew this voice well. It was a longtime church member. It was NBA basketball legend, David Robinson. He said, reflecting back on that day in 1999, Max Lucado said this. He said, just 12 hours before that communion service, David Robinson had scored over 30 points to lead the San Antonio Spurs to a playoff victory. It was watched by millions of people around the globe. But then he added, but David will be the first to tell you that playoff game didn't compare to the precious moments that he had with his son on that Sunday. And years later, after the headlines have faded and the games will be forgotten, it won't matter who won or lost on the court. He said, what will matter is that young boy had a daddy who told him about Jesus and about His grace. Dads, that's what this is all about. I mean, we chase after so many things. We chase after way too many things. What matters most is that we, along with our families, we know Jesus and the grace that He freely offers. Today, if you're here with us, and again, I know every family situation is different, and if you don't have a father in your home, or if you're a single parent, listen, I know it's tough. You lean heavily on your Heavenly Father. You just trust in Him every single day to take care, to fill in those gaps, to do what you cannot do. Parents of two parents, you do the same thing. But today, if you've never trusted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, if you've never placed your faith in Him, we want you to do that. It's the greatest gift that God has ever given. We have a Father. No matter what your life was like as you grew up, no matter what your father was like, you have a Heavenly Father who is crazy about you. The Bible says when someone comes to know Jesus, you know what happens? Heaven throws a party. The angels rejoice. And so today, maybe you've never placed your trust in Christ for the first time. I want to give you that chance to do so. Or maybe today you come to make this your home church or for prayer, whatever it may be. Let's be standing, and we're going to sing, and we invite you to come as we stand.